Nationalsozialisten, nur die besten Nationalsozialisten sind Parteigenossen.
For Adolf Hitler, victory meant more than the opportunity of implementing his perverse racial views. European conquest and global domination would also enable him to redesign Germany and the occupied territories along the lines of his equally twisted architectural ambitions. His legacy would be a series of building projects on a scale never before seen, as he attempted to construct a truly Nazi world. In this episode, I'll examine how the Nazis began to stamp their mark on Germany and the nations that had fallen under their jackboot. From Hitler's plans to redesign Berlin as the capital of the world, to the destruction of Warsaw, which would make way for a Nazi model city as an ever-expanding building program acted as a catalyst for the enslavement, extermination, and destruction of entire nations and their histories and cultures. On the 28th of January 1938, just 2 months after Hitler announced his intention to acquire living space for Germany, the world was presented with his plans for the complete redevelopment of the German capital, Berlin. The designs that Hitler and his architects, including Albert Speer, had produced were nothing short of monumental, for this was city planning on a truly biblical scale. It would be known as Germania, and the city was intended to become nothing less than the capital of the entire world.
Germania was a grand, I think some would say grandiloquent plan to rebuild Berlin, not just as the new capital of Germany, but as the capital of the world, Welthauptstadt, as the Germans called it.
So it sort of grew up during the sort of wartime period that he was planning the future of Berlin, and it was on an absolutely huge scale.
Really, the idea behind it is to imperialize Berlin. So it becomes more imperial than any other imperial city in the world, more than Paris, more than London, more than Washington. It becomes the ultimate imperial city.
The key characteristic of the plan, which was pulled together by Hitler's chief architect, Albert Speer, was to create these roads, east-west and north-south axes, which were massive roads, something like 120 meters wide, 5-6 kilometers long, and also to put up new buildings which were completely out of proportion to the existing buildings that were there.
In his early life, Hitler had wanted to become an artist and had twice applied to study at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. His application was denied on both occasions, and with the Academy suggesting that he instead consider taking up architecture due to the accomplished way he had drawn the buildings in his paintings.
He wasn't very good at drawing people, but he was pretty good at drawing buildings. And he said that if he couldn't be an artist, he'd like to be an architect.
He really thought of himself as an artist and an architect, a builder rather than destroyer. I mean, that's is so ironic, really. Becoming dictator, of course, it gives him the chance now to indulge himself in architecture.
But Hitler needed someone to make his architectural dreams a reality. And that person was Albert Speer. Speer joined the Nazi Party in 1931. A young and gifted architect, Speer soon rose through the political ranks to become a prominent member of Hitler's inner circle.
Speer was an ordinary young architect. He did join the Nazi Party, but he joined quite late. He was a technocrat. He was a modern-minded man.
He was from the upper middle class, so he's very unlike a lot of Hitler's early followers. And many people have said he was Hitler's unrequited love, because he was indulged terrifically.
But he was prepared to accede to Hitler's very strong ideas on what architecture should look like. Hitler was an anti-modernist. He didn't like modern ideas in art or in architecture. He liked classic designs based on ancient Greek and Roman designs. He liked domes, he liked columns, he liked buildings massive in their grandeur. And Speer was prepared to go along with this and design and build buildings exactly in conformity with Hitler's wishes.
The original plans drawn up by Albert Speer himself are now held in the Landesarchiv in Berlin. I've come to meet with historian of German architecture, Professor Wolfgang Schecker, to get a better idea of the Nazis' vision for Berlin. Wow, this looks very impressive. What's this?
That is the so-called Triumph Arch.
And how big is this arch? In meters, how tall is that?
It's at least it was 120 meters high.
At 120 meters high, the arch would have been over 20 meters higher than the Statue of Liberty in New York. And if that wasn't enough to have impressed the people who stood before it, they would simply have had to have gazed through the gigantic arches at what would have been the largest building ever constructed in the history of the world. Through it, I can't help but notice this big dome here, which, of course, is the Great Hall, isn't it?
That is a Great Hall.
There was a plan for a People's Hall, a Volkshalle, which would have had a dome 16 times the size of the Dome of St. Peter's in Rome.
The People's Hall was to have had a staggering combined height of 290 meters, which is over twice as high as the Great Pyramid of Giza. Sitting on top of its enormous dome would have been an 80-foot-high golden eagle looming over the city. And inside this colossal structure, a giant arena with 3 tiers of seating, which would have allowed Hitler to address some 180,000 faithful listeners. But Speer had calculated that having all those people under one roof would have presented an unusual problem. I understand that the dome was so big it would have had its own atmosphere.
Yeah, that is right. The engineers has to make sure that no clouds would come inside this big dome.
It would have been impractical because all the breath of those people would have brought about rain clouds within the dome of the Great Congress Hall.
This cross-section of the inside of the Great Hall gives a fantastic sense of scale of the size of it, because right down here, these are the little seats, yes? So this here is the size of a football stadium today.
I think there are probably 2 main reasons why they were conceived on such a large scale. One was actually a sort of practical one, that, the Nazis wanted to choreograph great public events where they brought, seriously large numbers of people. But I think there was another, really important psychological, symbolic reason, which was the sense of demonstrating to the ordinary German the magnitude and power of the Nazi state.
Stadt und Land zusammenfasst. Arbeiter, Bauer, intellektuelle, geistige Arbeiter.
Was it possible to have actually built the dome?
Yes, it was. Some years ago, I have really proved that, and it was possible this dome to erect it in this way.
I mean, it would have been entirely feasible. I mean, Speer was knocking down apartment blocks and houses to make way for these buildings. And after all, the Germans did build these enormous flat towers, anti-aircraft towers, which also provided air raid shelters for thousands of Berliners. Massive great construct. So, I mean, it would have been entirely possible.
It's when you look at this model that you realise quite how enormous the Great Hall was intended to be. Next to it are two little models of the Brandenburg Gate and the Reichstag, both of which are here in Berlin, and buildings I know well. They're big buildings, and yet when you place them next to the Great Hall, they look absolutely tiny. This is architecture on an absurd scale.
I think the Nazis suffer from an inferiority complex, and whereas we were Great Britain, they had to be Greater Germany. And I think the same thing that, you know, they saw the wonderful buildings in New York, the skyscrapers and that, we must outdo those wretched Americans. And we must show, by the size of our buildings, the power of the Reich.
One of the things I've learned about coming here today is that you shouldn't just see Germania as a building project or an architectural scheme. It was a lot more than that. Hitler dreamed it up when he was in prison in the 1920s. And that, of course, was when he was writing Mein Kampf. So Germania and Mein Kampf are twin projects. Germania is an expression of Hitler's evil, and it's an evil that will lead the world to war. While the demands of war curtailed much of Hitler's building program and Allied bombing destroyed most of the rest, there are still places in Berlin today where you can see his vision of Germania. That's if you know where to look.
When they were planning the rebuilding of Berlin, they realized that actually some of these structures might be simply so large and so heavy that they needed to test whether the rather unstable ground on which Berlin is built could actually hold them. And they built a test tower, a heavy load-bearing test tower it was called. Remarkably, it's still there. And this was built to test the load-bearing potential of the Berlin ground.
I have to say, it's a little nerve-wracking standing in here because above me is 12,650 tons of concrete, which is about the same as 8,500 cars. And you've got to remember that this is an experiment. You feel a long way from modern Berlin, and you feel as though you're just about in the Berlin of Albert Speer and Adolf Hitler. Not Berlin, but Germania. It's fantasy world capital that he wanted to create. And in a way that this building is not so much an experimental piece of architecture, it's not a load-bearing stone, it's a foundation stone. Alexander Kropp is a journalist and historian here in Berlin. I've come to meet him to get a better idea of what the landscape of the city would have looked like if Germania had been completed. We're standing in what would have been called Adolf Hitler Platz, Adolf Hitler Square. What would we have seen if we were standing here in 1950 and Germania had been finished?
Now we are in the front of the Reichstag building, and in the left over there, there would be the new Reichstag.
The new, and how big would the new Reichstag have been?
As large, a bit larger than the old one, and the old one would become the library of the new Reichstag. And then we will see the biggest building in the world, the so-called Great Hall.
And that dome would have been 5 times higher than the Reichstag over there. I mean, that's enormous.
That's correct. And on the top of the dome, there would be a Laterne, and after this Laterne, there was planned eagle sitting on a globe.
The world.
Yes, the world, and that's the symbol of the symbol for Hitler's wishes to be the master of the world.
Yeah, it's obvious metaphor.
Yes.
And then what would have been next to the Great Hall as we work our way around here?
Yeah.
What would have been over there?
Where the chancellery is now located, there was planned Hitler's palace.
Right.
Really a huge and wide building, only with one little hole in the middle and a balcony. And this was planned as the position of Hitler to speak to 1 million people here at Adolf Hitler Platz.
So that would have been his personal little spot to address.
Yes.
1 million people would have fitted into all this area here.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
But Germania wasn't just an idea that lived purely on architectural plans and drawings. It was a reality that was already well underway. Alexandra is taking me to another place where the Nazis had started the first stage of construction of their new mega city. This feels like we're in a little slice of Germania.
Yes, this is the former east-west axis, part of the two big streets of Germania, from the north-south axis and the east-west axis. And it was a former street so-called Charlottenburger Chaussee, and it was made wider in the middle 30s and was reopened on Hitler's birthday on 1939.
So this big wide street is all a big birthday present for Hitler?
Yes, and there was a big parade on his birthday here. This was the opening ceremony of this street from Germania.
And we've also got this big building. This looks like a big office building. Is that another part of Germania?
Yes, because this is the only building from Germania which was built here in this part of the east-west axis. It was planned in the middle 30s, and the start of the building was also before Second World War started, and it was finished at the beginning of the 50s, and it was the house for the German communities.
So all of Germania would have looked like that?
Yes, in this part, yeah.
Hitler wanted to outdo everyone. He literally wanted things to be bigger and better than everyone else.
Impression is everything. Propaganda is the religion of the regime. It's all about persuasion. It's all about imposing the regime's idea on you. But it's also all about empowering your imagination. They want you to admire them. They want you to be in awe of their power, their splendor, their superhuman qualities, which meant superhuman buildings.
I think there's no doubt that when you look at the architectural plans of the Nazis, that, you know, they were predicated on the idea that by the time the war started, it was a war that Germany was going to win. In a way, I suppose, many historians would say that Hitler put an awful lot of effort into dreams, delusions, and perhaps not enough into military strategy.
Today, Berlin is a creative, vibrant and cosmopolitan city where its citizens are free to lead their lives democratically and without constant threat from the state. Thankfully, it's a million miles away from what Hitler had in store for it. So therefore, we can just write it off, surely, as just another one of those mad Hitler plans, another one of those excessive ideas born out of his megalomania. Well, I'd argue otherwise, as this space around me is the legacy of Germania. This space tells you how much of the city that Hitler knocked down and how much men, material and labour he put into it. Germania was a key part of Nazi policy. A project the size of Germania was going to require vast resources, such as building materials, manpower, and a lot of money. But above all else, it was going to need space, lots of it. During the time of the planning of Germania, Berlin was a city of over 4 million people, about 80,000 of whom were Jews.
This was a totalitarian state. When the government made a demand, you had to click your heels. It was pretty non-negotiable, and he would have flattened all kinds of apartment buildings, all kinds of roads, a lot of the urban core of Berlin, in fact. People would have been moved.
A lot of people being thrown out of their residences without any sort of form of compensation were Jewish residents of Berlin who were subsequently, of course, deported east to their murder.
There was no conception of the human cost that this would have been, and indeed no conception of the financial cost.
The planned construction of Germania was a direct catalyst in the persecution of the Jews and the subsequent evolution of the concentration camp system. This is Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and it's built just 22 miles north of Berlin. It was used by the Nazis to incarcerate enemies of the Third Reich from the nearby capital, but it also had another purpose. Between 1936 and 1945, over 200,000 prisoners passed through the gates here. They were made up of Russian captives, political dissidents, Jews, and other undesirables.
The first concentration camps were established in March 1933 by Himmler and guarded by the SS and also by the stormtroopers, the SA. But, of course, Himmler thought, well, you know, it's all very well having these people being re-educated in Nazi terms to become good Germans, but also he must make these places economically viable to pay for themselves. So that's why concentration camps had their own speciality at Sachsenhausen. It was the making of bricks.
The Nazis soon realised that the inmates that they had under their control were not just prisoners, but an untapped source of free labour. And during the summer of 1938, the inmates at Sachsenhausen were forced to work on the construction of the Klinkerwerk Oranienburg, the world's largest brickworks, designed specifically to supply the building materials for Hitler's new world capital. But it wasn't just Berlin that Hitler had plans for. He wanted new constructions to take place all over the Third Reich. To build all of these projects was going to require a massive amount of labour and materials, and such factors played a key role in the location and development of concentration camps. For example, Mauthausen, Buchenwald and Flossenburg were all located next to natural deposits of quality stone, and prison labour worked to extract this stone from the earth and ship it to the grand architectural projects throughout the whole of the Third Reich.
It was quickly realized by the Nazis that they could serve a double purpose in the concentration camp. They could punish and detain their enemies there and eventually exterminate a lot of them, but they could also become an integral part of the Nazi economy, because you didn't have to pay people who were enslaved and your prisoners already, and you could work them and work them to death, in fact, at very, very little cost.
The concentration camps now became something a little bit different. They weren't just against opponents anymore. They were like for racial purity, and they were bringing people in who were going to do hard work and to make bricks or raw materials. So they were utilizing the prisoner population to make money.
There's something doubly inhumane about Sachsenhausen, because the Jews who were sent here were kicked out of their homes in Berlin, which were then flattened to prepare for Germania. And the Jews who ended up here were then forced to make bricks which would then be used to build Germania over the site of their destroyed homes.
In the plans to rebuild Berlin as the sort of world capital, and quite a lot of suffering happened for a lot of people to get to where they did get. So, people were forced from their homes, including a lot of Jewish people who were forced out of parts of Berlin for land clearance. It's not the case to say that some of these plans that never happened are somehow victimless. There were many, many victims.
While concentration camp prisoners worked to provide the material for the projects, the Nazis swept through Europe. Occupied cities destined for redesign were treated brutally. The most infamous example was Warsaw, the historic capital of Poland. And in 1939, when it fell to the Nazis, a city of 1.5 million inhabitants. Plans for the remodelling of Warsaw were well underway even before the invasion of Poland. They were known as the Pabst Plan, after Friedrich Pabst, the Nazi chief architect for Warsaw. And they detailed nothing less than the almost total obliteration of the city, the liquidation of its entire population, and its rebuilding as the so-called New German City.
The city of Warsaw, in a few weeks of the first campaign of the Second World War, was about 80% destroyed.
It was a decapitation strategy. We will destroy the Polish elite. And in the first few months, the last months of 1939, is what they tried to do. Murder the lawyers, the judges, the professors, all of these people. They wanted to destroy Polish culture.
The plans had one main objective: destroy the ancient city of Warsaw, including most of its historic buildings. Then build a new city, which would have had a much smaller population of about 130,000 people, which was insignificant compared to the 1.5 million people who actually did live in pre-war Warsaw. Now, the population would consist of just ethnically pure Germans, with a forced labor settlement of non-Germans on the other side of the river. The Nazis wasted no time in making their terrifying vision a reality. Within a year, their plans were put into action. What ensued was one of the darkest periods in Poland's history. In 1940, the northern part of Warsaw was turned into a Jewish ghetto. It would go on to hold 400,000 people in an area barely larger than a square mile. It was surrounded by watchtowers and walls some 10 foot high, and from there, transit to extermination camps became routine. With the Jews under control, the next step was the removal of the original population of the city, either through deportation to the camps, such as the newly built Warsaw concentration camp, or to Germany to work as slave labour. But 2 years later, in August 1944, the Poles fought back in an event now called the Warsaw Uprising. It failed, and the Nazis went into overdrive. Hitler ordered the total destruction of the city, and by January 1945, 85% of it had been destroyed. However, the changing fortunes of the war in the East meant that the Nazis' plans to rebuild the destroyed city in their image never came to fruition. And when they were finally forced to abandon the city in 1945, they simply left behind them utter devastation. It's incredible to think what this city would have gone through, and what it might have gone through had the Nazis actually achieved victory. Warsaw would have been the first Nazi model city. The historical buildings destroyed, the history wiped out, the population murdered. And it would have been the first of many places to have suffered this fate. The Nazis never got to implement their redesign of Warsaw. But one place where you can get a good idea of the type of structures that would have stood there is Nuremberg, in Germany. It was the centre of the Nazi Party from 1927, when the first Nuremberg rally was held here. And when the Nazis did come to power in 1933, it was decided that this was where all subsequent rallies would take place. So Albert Speer set about creating a collection of buildings designed to help portray Hitler not only as a leader of the party, but the leader of a mighty empire. The rally grounds were to be comprised of 8 structures, sprawling across a staggering 11 square kilometres. But only one part was ever completely finished, the Zeppelin Field. Designed to resemble the Pergamon altar of Greece, and consisting of a 360-metre wide grandstand, it was one of Albert Speer's first creations for the Nazi Party, and Hitler used it to full effect. This is the spot where Hitler would have stood to address the party faithful during one of the mighty Nuremberg rallies. You have to imagine 200,000 men and women in uniform. And behind me, on the tribune stand itself, would have been enormous swastika flags. These are all the normal trappings of Nazi might. The thing about the Nuremberg rally grounds is that had Hitler won the war, they wouldn't have been unique. All over Europe and indeed the world had he conquered it. There would have been rally grounds like this in nearly every country and every territory. And if it wasn't Hitler talking at them, it would have been one of his many puppet dictators who would have taken great delight in whipping up crowds and encouraging people to follow the Nazi creed.
There's no doubt that Hitler, I think, saw himself not just as the Führer and the Chancellor of Germany, but as a modern-day emperor. I think at the time, Hitler and other leading Nazis, believed their own propaganda. And they believed that what they were doing was creating a new German empire.
Hitler wanted to replicate the might projected by the architecture of history's greatest empires. He had become inspired by the grand, ancient buildings of Greece and Rome, seeing them as great symbols of power. And just like the emperors of Rome, he too wanted his own amphitheatre. The largest surviving building is the Congress Hall. It was designed to accommodate some 50 to 60,000 people, and it was modelled on the Colosseum in Rome.
Congress Hall was for having the great party congresses, the great party meetings and gatherings, so its function was entirely political. It was essentially the ultimate podium from which Hitler could perform.
It would have been able to hold 50,000 people indoors. I think there's probably only one place in the world today which can actually hold that number of people. It was part of the rebuilding and the refashioning of this big space on the edge of Nuremberg to be the centre of the Nazi Party rallies.
There would have been permanent military parades on the concourse outside and so forth. He let his imagination run away with him, but essentially it was all about the Nazi Party.
Work stopped on it in 1939, so it was never finished. And if you go to it now, it's this rather eerie, sort of semicircular building. So it was only sort of half built. Rather sort of forlorn relic and a reminder of, you know, the sheer scale, the frightening scale of what Speer and Hitler planned. You know, had the tide of history been different.
You can't help but be struck by the absolute enormous size of this building. It was designed to house some 50,000 Nazis who were going to gather here for the party rallies and to listen to their beloved Führer. Although it remains to this day as a huge structure, the Congress Hall was never completed. And at 39 metres high, it's still over 30 metres short of its planned 70-metre height. And that would have been covered by an enormous self-supporting roof. To find out more about what would have taken place here, I've been joined by German historian and Nuremberg resident, Dr. Alexander Schmidt. What was so important about Nuremberg? Why was this building built here?
Nuremberg is a symbol of the old Germany. The medieval city was a city who is seen as typical for the old ages. And so Nuremberg is a symbolic background for Germany. And they wanted to Berlin. And Nuremberg was one step to Berlin.
I see. So this is a very important stepping stone.
Yeah.
Now, this is a very big building, but were there plans to have it in even bigger buildings in Nuremberg?
Yeah, the biggest building was a big stadium, the German stadium, the biggest stadium of the world. The first time Albert Speer tried to build the biggest of the world, and in the future, this was his concept.
And how much bigger would that stadium have been than this building?
More than 2.5. 400,000 people can go in this stadium and see some kind of war games, fight games, not normal sports. They call it NS-Kampfspiele, also war games.
Just like the Colosseum in Rome, spectators would have been treated to a gladiatorial display from Hitler's armed forces, showcasing their strength and fighting skills, while further impressing the might of the Nazi Empire on the German people. The greatest sportsmen from across Germany would have competed in the proposed annual Pan-Germanic Athletics, while Hitler envisaged that every subsequent Olympic Games would now be held at the Deutsches Stadion.
I think Hitler undoubtedly had a thing about the empires of the past. He was entranced by his visit to Rome in May 1938 to see all the surviving parts of Roman architecture which bored Mussolini stupid. I think that he saw, that the Third Reich Empire would in thousands of years' time hopefully be seen in the same light.
He loved classical buildings, so he did have this idea that buildings reflected the power of a regime. So he would go back to the classical buildings of Greece and Rome, and he would want to create buildings on that scale. So that's why we see Nazi architecture is very much influenced by Hitler himself. Hitler wants lavish buildings, not of the Gothic style, he wants them of the classical Romanesque style.
The architecture reflected their belief that they were creating, a new German empire. And buildings like the Congresshalle in Nuremberg, had it ever been completed, would have been just part of, a type of architecture which would have indeed been imperial.
One of the hallmarks of Nazi architecture and the whole idea of Germania is this sense of scale. Do you think that had history been very different, we would have seen more buildings like this around Europe and around maybe elsewhere?
Surely, because they had big plans for many cities, not only for Berlin or Nuremberg or Munich, for Linz, for many little towns. And in the other countries, it's the same development.
Albert Speer and Hitler envisaged future generations marveling at the ruins of the great empires that once ruled the world. Except alongside the decaying structures of Rome, Greece and Egypt, they hoped would stand the buildings of the Third Reich. Hitler commissioned many of his architectural plans to show not only the buildings as they are intended to look, but also as they would have been when they were in ruins. Clearly, in 1,000 years, even Hitler realized that some of these buildings would not have been still standing, but he wanted their remains to continue to symbolize his ideology.
Hitler and Speer often talked about what they called ruin value, and they espoused the idea of ruin value, which basically was the idea that when you build something, you should build it so that it achieves its purpose and is architecturally pleasing for the present. You should build it so that it actually lasts a long time, but also you should build it that when it actually eventually does crumble, it will crumble in an aesthetically pleasing way. And again, there was an echo back to Roman and Greek remains, the idea that, 1,000 years on, they talked about the 1,000-year Reich, but, even beyond that, people would look back and look at these remains from the Third Reich era, and this would reflect well on that era.
But as we watch these buildings decay and rot, many of them unfinished, it would be easy to see them as simply the follies of a megalomaniac dictator, and to separate the creation of Hitler's architecture from his war crimes. It was probably for that reason that at the Nuremberg trials, Albert Speer received a sentence of only 20 years in prison, while other high-ranking Nazi members were sentenced to death. Maybe they hadn't yet realized that these grand building projects were a key driver to the building of the concentration camp network, the persecution of Jews and peoples of the occupied territories, all of which contributed to the start of the war, and that had the plans been carried out in full, they would have meant the destruction of national histories, the enslavement and extermination of native populations, and the realization of the Nazi dream of a 1,000-year Reich.